Hello and welcome to another Village Torah portion discussion with me, your host, Rabbi Drew. We have actually a double portion, Behar and Bechukotai. We are now finishing up the book of Leviticus with the double portion. As it turns out, this Shabbat, we are experiencing the third out of the last four Torah portions being a double Torah portion. We are finishing up Leviticus. It almost was kind of a whirlwind, as I mentioned. We've now gone through 7 different Torah portions in the last 4 weeks. So this is definitely cramming a lot in. Now in Behar-Bechukotai, we're finishing off. We got a bunch of things, but one of the more interesting facets that we certainly see, at least in Behar and certainly chapter 25 here in Leviticus, is the institution of Shemitah. Okay? Now, with Shemitah, which is, I'm not really sure how to translate it, except to say it is a year in which we leave the land fallow, or more specifically, we're really not gathering the produce from farming. Many of us, maybe all of us, certainly most of us, are not actively involved in agrarian pursuits. We are not harvesting. Nevertheless, certainly back in biblical times, it was certainly very much a huge issue, and even for many, many centuries through Talmudic times, and it actually still very much affects what's going on even today in Israel. And even though most Jews who live in the land of Israel are not farmers, it very much is, there are still Jews who farm. We still need to eat. We get produce off of the land. Actually, as it turns out, the next Jewish year is one such a Shemitah year. So now what is Shemitah? Okay, great question. So we have in the first several, I'm going to read the first 4 verses in chapter 25. We have here, the Lord spoke unto Moses at Mount Sinai, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel and say unto them, when you come into the land which I give you, and then shall the land keep a Shabbat or a Sabbath unto the Lord. So it's not just we're keeping a Shabbat, but the land is keeping a Shabbat. Now verse 3, 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard, and gather in the produce thereof. Verse 4, but in the 7th year, the 7th year shall be a Sabbath or a Shabbat of solemn rest for the land. It is a Shabbaton, which is interesting language. We don't see it much. We did see it by Yom Kippur. We just saw in chapter 23, last week's Torah portion regarding Yom Kippur is that Shabbaton. So it was a really intense resting, a really intense Sabbath. It is a Sabbath unto the Lord. You shall neither sow your field nor prune your vineyard. Okay. Certainly, on the one hand, for farmers, you're working 6 years, you're doing all this agricultural, agrarian work, and on the one hand, it's nice. 6 years of heavy labor, 7th, it's a rest. That's nice. On the other hand, what are you going to do for food? Think about that. That is a huge vulnerability. This is your source of food, and you won't have it. You have no access to it. Deeply scary, deeply vulnerable. Wow. Right? That's certainly really vulnerable for farmers. On the other hand, to take a transition, also think about this. This is really fascinating to me, how much the word Shabbat is included in even just these verses 2 through 4 here in chapter 25. We have it 1, 2, twice in verse 2, and then you get a sort of a doubling of it in the verse 4, and then you get a 5th. So 5 times in these 3 verses it gets mentioned. So there's a really heavy emphasis on this word Shabbat, resting. This is really what it's about. Also interesting, we have seen, going all the way back to the very beginning of Genesis, yes, God worked. He was very intensely involved with creating everything. And on the 7th day, even God rested. And then we see in Exodus, the book of Exodus, where the Jews, the Bnei Israel, the children of Israel, are commanded 6 days you can work, the 7th you rest for God. okay? And there is a commemorative aspect harkening back to when God created everything, that he worked for 6 days, rested on the seventh. So too we, out of and not just copying God, although that is not an unimportant aspect of it, copying God, imitating God, being godlike, really, but also in some way providing testimony to God having created 6 days, creating everything and being productive, and then relaxing, resting, and just sort of enjoying the fruits of one's labors for that seventh day. Now, that is, so to speak, our Sabbath, right? That is the Sabbath for Bnei Israel, for the children of Israel. What this is saying, which is interesting, is now there's a Sabbath for the land. V'shavta ha'aretz Shabbos l'Adonai. In verse 2 we get, then shall the land keep a Sabbath, or shall it rest for the Lord? Which is interesting. We don't normally think about inanimate objects, certainly not earth or land, having necessarily its own rest, but there's something to be said for it. Obviously, it's nowadays we can think about the various chemical stuff and how nitrogen plays into it, and depletion of resources and nitrogen and other different chemicals in the dirt, and how that can affect produce. I think we can think about that way. But also what it does for not just thinking about the earth, the land, the various plants, or even the farmers, but what's going on as well. Because those aren't the only sort of players going on. Those aren't the only actors that we are discussing. We have this interesting rabbinic Midrash. I've mentioned Midrash in this series before. Midrash is an expounding, kind of like a narrative expansion. It provides different insights that are some fascinating stuff beyond what we just encounter in the text. So we have here the very beginning of Vayikra Rabbah, or Leviticus Rabbah. It's an old Midrash. Rabbi Isaac says, and he actually is kind of quoting Psalms 103:20 as the mighty in strength that fulfill God's word. So Rabbi Isaac says this verse in Psalms, the mighty in strength that fulfills one's word, that fulfills God's word, he says this refers to those who are willing to observe the sabbatical year, this Shemitah year. In the way of the world, a person may be willing to observe a commandment for a day, a week, even a month. But is this person likely to continue to do so through the remaining days of the year? Well, but throughout that year, this mighty person sees one's field declared ownerless during this Sabbath year, their fences broken down, and one's produce consumed by others. Yet this person continues to give up one's produce without saying a word. Can you conceive of a person mightier than this person? Really fascinating insights here from Rabbi Isaac, Rabbi Yitzchak, of really what this looks like, and really for the farmer themselves. And if we can be a little bit gendered about it, it's often certainly in Rabbi Isaac's time, I think I was trying to gender neutralize it, but he was being very gendered about it. This man who sees his field declared ownerless, his fences broken down, his produce consumed by others, yet he continues to give up his produce without saying a word. Can you conceive of a person mightier than this farmer? Now, it's interesting to think about that as strength, right? That we don't necessarily conceive of holding back or containing oneself as necessarily strength, which is one aspect, but even just the insight to see what's going on in the farmer's head, to give up this year, even without the notion of having an anxiety about how one will feed one's family if they're not harvesting their own field. Hopefully they may have saved up from the previous 6 years of their harvesting the land, and we'll think about that for this seventh year, right? Hopefully. And so even if we're going to set that aside, there's something to be said for here where this person, this farmer, sees with their eyes that their field is declared ownerless, so anybody can come. So that's bad enough. And then their produce consumed by others. Okay, that's really also tough to see. Fences broken down. That is really fascinating for me. It could be for you as well. There's nothing, it's not part of this mitzvah for one's fences to be broken down. That's nowhere, okay? Yes, allowing others to consume the produce, yes, that's there. But fences broken down? This is an insight of Rabbi Isaac's here. Because inevitably, what will happen when you allow just anybody to come into your field? Well, they're probably going to break down those fences to gain access to your fields. It's an unfortunate reality that Rabbi Isaac here is pointing out to us. And then this person continues to give up their produce without saying a word. That's part of the practice. Like, what are you going to say? Those people are going to have access to your field. They're going to have access to your produce. They're probably going to do some destruction of your property, because that will probably just happen. That's really tough. That's really tough. And I think that's what Rabbi Isaac here is pointing out, that there's a lot of kind of an emotional like willpower, as it were, to hold back and to be able to give that up, to allow that to happen. Really tough. Absolutely really tough. And I think that's why he is pointing out this verse in Psalms, the mighty in strength that fulfill God's word. Because that's not easy. And that's not for everybody to do. A lot of people would get very concerned and very worried. Okay. Now, there's an interesting comment from around the turn of the 17th century by Rabbi Shlomo Ephraim, son of Aaron Lunchitz. And what he points out in his commentary, Kli Yakar, he says this year of Shemitah, and here's some penetrating insights, promotes a sense of fellowship and peace through the suspension of cultivation, even for the needy of your people. For one is not allowed to exercise private ownership over any of the seventh year produce. And this is undoubtedly a primary factor in promoting peace, since most dissension originates from the attitudes of mine is mine, one person claiming it is all mine, and the other claiming it is all mine. But in the seventh year, all are equal, and this is the real essence of peace. V'zeh be'emet inyan hashalom. This is the real essence of peace, as Rabbi Lunchitz points out. So here, Rabbi Lunchitz is broadening our perspectives, right? The land, it gets to rest. Yes, the farmers get their rest. They have their anxieties. And as we saw from Rabbi Isaac in the Midrash, they definitely have their anxieties, not just about providing food for their own family, but also their own property and seeing all these things. Rabbi Lunchitz here is pointing out that this is also promoting peace and fellowship, that it promotes kahal v'hashalom. Okay, so it promotes these things. And also people are very possessive, right? That's what he meant. Mine is mine, mine is mine. People are very privately possessive. But here, it's not about exercising private ownership. It's about saying everybody's equal. Real essence of peace. You know, it's interesting because it makes me think about, for those who've ever experienced going to summer camp, that everybody's in the same dwellings, right? You're all in the bunks, and you go and you eat in the dining hall, and everybody eats pretty much the same food. And there's this sense there is a sense of peace and fellowship, because it really is nice to have that, I don't know, everybody's fairly equal, right? And so this is what Rabbi Lunchitz is pointing out. This is 1 year, okay? 1 year out of 7. This isn't all the time. It's not necessarily meant to be a full-on utopia forever, but it's certainly fascinating even for this one thing. One more I want to quote. This is from actually the 20th century. So this is from Rabbi Avraham Isaac Cook, who died in 1935. So this is from the early 20th century. So he writes, "The treasure of the nation, the divine blessing that is implanted in it, the order of the world, the righteous and good life, lived in harmony with justice and honesty, peace and tranquility, grace and courage, permeated by the all-embracing contemplation of the divine purpose as it exists in the national soul, No call will be activated in the day-to-day life. The very nature of this life obfuscates the spiritual majesty of the divine soul which dwells in the nation, and prevents its bright and shining light from penetrating the profane reality. Life can only be perfected through the affording of a breathing space from the bustle of everyday life. The individual shakes himself free from ordinary weekday life at short and regular intervals every Shabbat. What the Shabbat achieves regarding the individual, the Shemitah, this resting year, achieves with regard to the nation as a whole. A year of solemn rest is essential for both the nation and the land. A year of peace and quiet without oppressor and tyrant. It is a year of equality and rest, in which the soul reaches out towards divine justice, towards God who sustains the living creatures with loving kindness. There is no private property and no punctilious privilege, but the peace of God reigns over all, in which there is the breath of life. Sanctity is not profaned by the exercise of private acquisitiveness over all this year's produce, and the covetousness of wealth stirred up by commerce is forgotten, for food, but not for commerce. So it's a really interesting, lovely words by Rav Kook here. Early 20th century, Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook. That's certainly more flowery language used to describe what the Shemitah year, this year of rest, is supposed to do and what it helps achieve. I really enjoy that line about, it's one thing for individuals on a weekly basis to achieve some sort of day of rest, of restfulness, but when he says a year of solemn rest is essential for both the nation and the land. So a year of peace and quiet without oppressor and tyrant. Okay, that's a bit much. Without oppressor and tyrant, that's pretty strong language, but it's certainly essential for both the nation and the land, which is really fascinating language here by Rabbi Kook. So we have this year of Shemitah, and as it turns out, there are some interesting aspects to it. There's even to the modern day. For many centuries, when Jews really were not, after the Jews were largely exiled from our land in the early centuries of the Common Era, there weren't so many Jews in the Middle Ages living in Israel. There were some. They were definitely there, even if very, very few. In fact, Rabbi Moses, son of Nachmanides, Rabbi Moses, son of Nachman, so he went in the early Middle Ages and he traveled. He said there weren't many, but there were some. But obviously, in the last few centuries, with more and more Jews able to return to our land, and it's been really great to see Shemitah, this year of rest, to be fulfilled and to take place. So it's not easy, and there's certainly some complications, and obviously nowadays it's definitely complicated. Nevertheless, there is certainly a beauty to allowing a year of rest for the land, just as we experience a rest every single week, 6 years of working, 6 days of working. We experience 6 days of working and a seventh day for resting. So too we are commanded here in the 25th chapter of Leviticus in this week's Torah portion, work the land for 6 years, rest in the seventh, which is, as Rabbi Kook points out, it's not only a rest for the land, get the nutrients, recycling, but also for ourselves, for those who are working the land, as well as achieving, as we saw from Rabbi Lunchitz, it also achieves this sort of promoting peace and prosperity for all, because you're allowing poor to have access to the land and to get sustenance from it. So there are many benefits, even if it's certainly a curious way, curious mitzvah that we have in our tradition. But I hope you enjoyed that, hopefully learned something about Shemitah, and I want to wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom.